hope it is rehumanizing and epistemically humbling as a result. Just to give you a sense of where Together came from aesthetically and also its experiential origins, this is Aftermath, also created after the LA fires. During COVID in 2020, I started playing around in my very, very small, dank, windowless studio with projection mapping, which is, by the way, perfect. If you ever want to experiment with projection mapping, find yourself a dank, windowless studio. And I projected onto my slipstream sculptures and realized that they became immediately uncanny, inverted simulations of AR. In other words, AR presented in a different form of materiality, and Aftermath really tests this at scale. Here you see it bathed in just a single hue, and it appears almost to float in space. People looking at it couldn't tell if it was real or fake. This isn't about trickery for trickery's sake, but rather to subvert expectations of materiality and to open the aperture to alternate forms of perception. And I just want to show you what it looks like with video on it. I don't know how many people here work in VFX, but if you've ever learned how to make smoke and fire, you probably realize how addictive it is, so I never miss an opportunity to do that. Let's get into AR. A core poetic of AR is that it occupies two spaces at once. It is both visible and invisible, and requires a prosthesis like a phone or a tablet, or, God forbid, meta glasses, which are tools of biometric theft and surveillance. That's my personal opinion. So I for now, recommend the phone or tablet. In this way, I do think of AR as a medium that gestures at some of the principles of quantum mechanics. AR is also well suited to expanding consciousness, inviting collaboration, and subverting hegemonic influence. At their best, AR projects can offer an evolving, distributed form of material engagement. When I created my free AR platform, Fourth Wall, in early 2018, I wanted to challenge assumptions about public art. Who decides what it is, where it goes, and why it matters? It was expressly anti-gatekeeping. I was curious what would happen if I offered my VR drawings, at the time, translated into AR, to an unknown audience to situate in their own chosen real-world contexts. What might these collaborations look like? What would Donna Haraway's sympoesis or co-making look like in practice? How might people make their own meaning with this additive digital layer of content, and what stories would they tell? I think of this as a very early form of social sculpture in my practice, community building through individual contributions and a growing online archive of interventions. The imagination and ingenuity people manifested in the early days of Fourth Wall were unbridled. People from all over the globe recorded my work in contexts from the hilarious to the poignant to the wildly inventive, and shared their captures online. This was one of the upsides of social media at the time, a real-time archive of this expanding creative collaboration. One collaborative moment in 2018 exponentially grew the scope of the app and of my own practice. My dear friend, the artist Tanya Aganiga, who you may know, is a border activist and was in Tijuana one day. Using the phone's touchscreen, she first placed my HoloPoint AR drawing, which you'll probably remember was the first VR drawing I showed you, in the United States, and then walked slowly backwards, pulling it through the border wall into Mexico, underscoring that art and ideas have no borders and cannot be contained. I want to show you what that looks like. This powerful intervention inspired Coordinates, a geolocation feature on Fourth Wall. I was able to invite artists who worked both digitally and in analog media to share their work in the exact locations and settings of their choosing, where it resonated the most for them, without any institutional permission. With so many histories being erased and rewritten, AR allows us to reinscribe and insist on those histories where they matter most. And speaking of erasure, I'm going to try and tell you the story very, very quickly. You'll notice the middle slide, we have a border wall in AR, and one of the things that was really important to Tanya a few years later, was that we create a border wall in AR that we mapped exactly, we actually went down, we did quite a bit of measuring and sample taking of the border wall at TJ, and to create it in AR with the prompt to anybody who uses it, place me somewhere that's separate. I think it's like place me somewhere where it separates you from someone or something you love. And what she wanted was for people to be able to experience the violence and the insult of the wall, even virtually. And we never really had like an official launch. It was underfunded as all things, and sadly we actually were able to launch it at the Frieze Art Fair in Los Angeles a few months ago, when she and her organization that does a lot of work with almost trans people in Tijuana, they were invited to be part of the fair. And once they got there, and they've been invited for years, and once they got there, the fancy galleries decided they actually didn't want to have people like Tanya and her compatriots present. So they put them, as she said, they became the Tijuana of the art fair. And so we ended up using the AR to underscore that separation and that inequity. So Coordinates has since become a curated section of the app that has hosted innumerable artist collaborations, exhibitions, and guerrilla interventions all around the globe. Here are just a handful of examples of such activations and exhibitions from 2018 to 2022. In Texas, you see In Plain Sight, a real-time skywriting intervention on behalf of detained immigrants in ICE detention centers and prisons, which Fourth Wall hosted in AR. We didn't obviously have anything to do with the actual skywriting, but we did host the AR skywriting. This was curated by Rafa Esparza and Castles. And in New Orleans, on the right, Battlegrounds, an exhibition which invited local artists to activate contested sites that they consider battlegrounds. And that was co-curated by my partner Jesse Damiani and me. And then the LA River, Defining Line, which I co-curated with Deborah Scacco. In every case, these artists wanted to signal, and these were not all digital artists, by the way. These are actually, most of these are not digital. They're like PNGs or JPEGs. These artists wanted to signal, message, or insist upon visibility of the unseen or unheard. Their work addressed indigenous colonization, queer communities, black histories, water wars, immigrant stories, and the prison industrial complex. We didn't ask permission to install any of these works, and they're still there, and their power was in the pairing of ideas to charged locations. Sometimes what appears to be a technical flaw, by the way, can also be an asset. Geolocation is a really fickle beast. I know we're going to get into some of the weeds with AR, but it lends itself to a certain instability, and I think that the occasional glitch also adds an uncontainable quality to these interventions, which I think is a plus. And I just want to share a couple of really recent interventions that I think of almost like graffiti, which required a different type of collaboration related to geolocation. And that is someone on the ground, often miles away, working with us in real time to adjust the location and scale of the works, often at great personal risk. SUC was a joint project with my partner Jesse Damiani. We conceived of SUC and installed it over the World Economic Forum Congress in Davos, Switzerland, and it's still there, to protest the greedy, hollow promises of the oligarchs and grifters of the Epstein class and their outsized global harms. I created State Property on the right in direct response to the overturning of abortion rights in the US, and its violent fracturing is intended to underscore the barbarism of the laws that have formed in its wake. It's over the Supreme Court and over several state houses throughout the US. And for the sake of time, I won't play these for you, but just know that they're there. Civic responsibility. I understand from Amelia that a lot of you here have a real interest in civic engagement and mutual aid, and that just like fills my heart and gives me hope about the future. So I threw this slide in, and I'm just going to say this really quickly, but civic responsibility and the abrogation of social contracts prompted me to create these two AR artworks in 2021. Motherboard for the Encoding Futures residency in LA, thanks to Mashinka, and Contract Killers, which I created during the NFT boom as a project of critique. In each case, I cited the works at or above civic institutions I felt had spinelessly failed the polities they were created to serve. I realize now I was railing against a collapse that was already well underway. But here, AR, as in the examples before, is intended to haunt these spaces. So that's just one other example. So Whereas I've always understood social sculpture to be as kind of a formless practice of public collaboration, I've come to think of it, at least as it applies to participatory AR, more as the condition of the encounter, a creative, co-constitutive, living archive built by and with whoever adds to it. The aggregated intelligence and ingenuity that results from each edition expands in all directions, limited only by the longevity of the technology itself. I'm thinking a lot about what Tiziana Terranova describes as a practice that will be able to produce different forms of subjectivity and different models of what an economy of social cooperation could be like. This project, I'm happy to say, has recently received funding, and we're making it now because it's going to, we hope, debut on July 4th. This is Free. Free is a participatory abolitionist AR artwork sited on Alcatraz Island, a potent symbol of colonized land and the increasingly profitable privatized American carceral system. 45% of Americans have had a loved one incarcerated, and 1,800 illegally detained prisoners remain missing from secret detention sites. Viewers will be invited through Fourth Wall to send a message of solidarity or a personal story related to imprisonment to anyone incarcerated in the US, including hundreds of children in detention, via a digital paper plane that transforms into a bird. Once each message reaches the island, it triggers an eruption of stories and messages, also transformed into birds, lifting from the island's highest point into a dazzling murmuration. The scale grows with each submission. And you'll be able to, users will be able to read what other people have submitted. So it's a collective, shared experience. Free draws attention to the human rights abuses of the emboldened prison industrial complex, legalized slavery under the 13th Amendment, ICE abductions, the loss of habeas corpus, and the highly racialized carceral system in the US. I have nothing to say about this slide, so I'm just going to read it for a second, and then I will move ahead. Can you see? Okay. Also, 2 books I highly recommend, which I also read for my fellowship. So this is hot off the press. Tell Me Everything is a project I developed from some of my research at this fellowship I described in Vienna. This interactive video work stages a live reckoning between a human participant and the extractive logics of algorithmic surveillance. Each viewer is invited to hand draw a gesture on a tablet. The mark appears on screen in real time, but only for an instant, as the system attempts to read it and fails, registering only noise, both sonic and visual. That noise mutates and resolves into a black, silk-like strand woven into an ever-growing digital spiderweb. At the moment the strand is added, the entire installation falls silent until the next contribution. The evolving web becomes a visual record of everything the system was denied: personal agency, individual data, creative expression. It captures and transforms the residue of failed surveillance into something connected, liquid, and resistant. Drawing on Laura Tripaldi's account of spider silk as a nanotechnological intelligence and Edward Glissant's concept of opacity as a political right, the work proposes refusal as a collective material practice. Each contribution becomes load-bearing, a structure that protects and supports the next. Over the course of the exhibition, the projected image moves toward full occlusion, a collective blackout, co-authored by its participants. Emerging from the realities of involuntary biometric theft, such as airports, flock cameras, state-weaponized surveillance authoritarian AI like Palantir, the Pentagon, ICE, cortisol, and dopamine hacking like social media, techno-feudalism, and the increasing necessity of encrypted and decentralized communication systems, Tell Me Everything transforms the act of mark-making into a counter-training mechanism. Participants experience the immediate disappearance of their own gesture and the quiet accumulation of a shared, untraceable record, and in the process, entrap the trappers. So, I guess we all hot and bothered when I read about that. So I'm just going to pivot to AR briefly as a form of land art. AR really allowed me to express ideas I had about ongoing ecocide in California's Coachella Valley with minimal harm to local flora and fauna, and to embrace alternative modes of perception. When I say minimal harm, I just want to really be very clear that all of these technologies cause enormous harm to flora and fauna and to humans, and the labor and mining that is required to support our habit, mostly disproportionately absorbed by the global south. So I just want to say that when I say that, I mean weren't digging up Earth. We weren't, moving things around like a lot of mostly male-dominated land art. But these are just two quick examples of commission works from 2019 to the Desert X Biennial that were inspired by, in addition to local and global climate data, Timothy Morton's book, Hyperobjects. Again, the human sensorium and spatial memory are really important to note here. At the Salton Sea, viewers were confronted with a monumental artwork that appeared over a toxic but beautiful water mass, the stench of chemicals on the wind, and the crunch of dead fish cartilage underfoot. Every sense was engaged. People spontaneously performed with the work by filming themselves and others interacting with it. This added another layer of public engagement that I hadn't anticipated, and the resulting captures were, like the early days of Fourth Wall, a data set that reflected the ingenuity of humans when invited to write themselves into their own narratives. So this project, I'm delighted to share with you, involves our very own Amelia Winger-Bearskin, with whom I was extremely lucky to collaborate in 2022. This is Mushroom Cloud. Mushroom Cloud was a project of ecological imagination, or even perhaps I should be so lucky, but Rosie Braidotti calls it ecosophical. Not this, she came up with that term, which I aspire to. When thinking about the climate emergency, I could think of no better symbol than the ultimate weapon of man-made cataclysm and ecocide, the mushroom cloud, a symbol that, of course, now is even more fraught than ever. My version was a tentacular, multinodal, biomimetic blockchain project, which is a lot of words. When I say biomimetic, I really love looking to systems and models in nature that basically do it better. Speaking of better ideas, they do it better than we do. I wanted to underscore the destruction and fragility of all interdependent ecosystems and to signal human responsibility. This traumatic symbol speaks its own devastating language, and I wanted to transform and restructure its visualization as an invitation to consider an alternative life-generating model. As the radioactive cloud dissolves, another mushroom cloud appears in counterpoint, one that is otherwise hidden from view underground. What spreads across the sky, as you'll see in a moment, is a mycelial network, the fungal colonies which form the connective tissue of all carbon-based life on Earth. These resilient and regenerative networks sustain life versus destroy it. The idea was to grow a supportive network like mycelium, and this was using blockchain and NFTs based on self-repairing structures. In Los Angeles, I'm going to show it to you over the Hudson. In Los Angeles, Amelia and I collaborated to really deepen the real-world impact of the project. So not only did Amelia create the most beautiful, haunting, bespoke soundscape for an accompanying video about the climate challenges specific to the West Coast, we wanted the project to really live into what it promised metaphorically. In other words, you run the risk with a lot of these projects of just being sort of nearly performative. And so the idea was that for every NFT sold, 10% of the proceeds from any sale would go to Amelia's Wampum Codes initiative, which gives financial support to indigenous innovators aiding land-back movements and indigenous sovereignty economies. And so that was really the missing piece, and I remain so grateful, Amelia, for that. I'm so proud of that. That's the part I'm most proud of in the whole project. So by blanketing the sky with the poetics of interconnectedness, I hoped viewers might perceive a communal, often invisible cloud, one that privileges generosity and mutual accountability more than anything. This is Mushroom Cloud. Allowed me to play with scale and expanded cinema in a way I simply could not in any other medium is corpus. And I created corpus in 2022, a word that means both body and data set used to train AI models. My mother, hilariously, can never remember corpus's name, so she just refers to them as that invisible man. So that invisible man was commissioned by the Berggruen Institute, and I was tasked with creating a future human for the Institute's What Will Life Become symposium. Corpus imagines a future of embodied entanglement among humans, machines, flora, the microbiome, digital code, and DNA, all in the form of this huge, towering, gender-fluid holobiont. Originally, Corpus appeared as this scaled to the ceiling of the Bradbury Building, which if you've seen a Blade Runner, you're probably well acquainted with the roof in downtown LA. Having them loom over viewers allowed me to underscore human smallness, to attempt to engender empathy for other species experiencing what it might feel like to encounter a living, breathing, monumental being. Corpus appears transparent in places for two reasons. First, to underscore the fluid nature of realities we've evolved for evolutionary fitness, and second, and I think more importantly, to position the body as a process versus an object. Pulsing electrical code flashes through the corpus's body, both to signal a fusion of genetic data, but also obliquely to trouble the ways in which data is used, or more likely abused, in the defining of bodies. Corpus's soundscape is composed of a blend of heartbeats: fetal, human, whale, cosmos, which is the two black holes colliding, and an AI interpolation of them all. And I'm going to play this, but I have to tell you, this project nearly killed me. It's really hard to engineer. At exactly the right perspective, and that was what made it so challenging. And then for their hammer iteration 2 years later, I created all new internal organs in VR and added lichen and microplastics and moss and colored fog to their body. And I think people driving down Wilshire Boulevard were like, this is a joke, because it was just an empty plinth. But of course, there was a sculpture there. You just needed to activate it with the phone. So Cento, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Cento. If you've been to the Whitney, this is a project that is currently, well, it's permanently on view at the Whitney. If you go to the 8th floor balcony, you can experience Cento, but you can also participate with Cento from anywhere in the world. Cento is really the conceptual spawn of Corpus, and it's a participatory AR project focused on a bioengineered future creature, an experimental living test for community building and adaptability in the face of the climate crisis, and it's co-built by a global audience. So Cento really asks, would a creature imagined as a collage of human, cephalopod, microbiome, avian, mycelial, and marine species, and machine of course, fulfill or even exceed basic evolutionary requirements for fitness on a volatile planet? What would a bioethically produced transcorporeal self look like? Could species egalitarianism exist in the body politic of a new hybrid creature? And how could humans contribute to co-building such a creature, and in doing so, become embedded in it themselves as a co-constitutive project? Anyone anywhere can add a feather to Cento's body, where it'll appear in real time. And each of the 12 feathers is endowed with a specific property that might ensure survival. Metaphorically, with each added feather, Cento's evolutionary fitness increases. And this is what a experience, this is what you see floating on the beach after this. One of the things we really wanted to look at was which evolutionary properties people considered most important, and whether that correlated with the time at which the feathers were selected. We actually suspect many were chosen not for their properties, but for their aesthetics, which slightly corrupts the data. But I just wanted to show you sort of what we were looking at when we created these analytics. And we don't obviously collect any user data. But Cento's affective impact really, really surprised me. Early on, I lamented the fact that Cento wasn't freaking people out. The people seemed to have developed a fondness for it. A fellow artist pointed out to me that it made perfect sense that by inviting people to contribute to Cento's survival, I'd invited them into a relationship of care, which is absolutely right, and has been a very humbling experience. I've received numerous DMs from parents whose children insist on visiting Cento on weekends. I had no idea it would prompt joy, and I think that's another thing I'd love to talk to you about, is like, what is the role of joy, particularly in a moment that feels bereft of joy? Dignified grown adults have pranced around the Whitney balcony, fake cowering and performing with the creature. Others have reported spending real time deliberating over which feather to choose and why. Ironically, AR's perceived ephemerality may contribute to its lasting impact on consciousness. One journalist wrote, "I keep going back to the fourth wall app, whether I'm sitting at home, riding the subway, or waiting for an appointment. Oddly, I find myself thinking about Cento's vulnerability, that it needs me, or maybe I need it. Cento calls for a caring commitment with our more than human kin, in the words of ecofeminist Donna Haraway." So I don't think we're going to have time for this, but I just want to say, I also did a project that was both censored and it won an award all in the same week. And it was called Body Politic, and we used a lot of the same rubric. It was about basically reproductive justice, data privacy, and voting rights. And we had a similar choice. You would choose between, sorry about that. It's just like a disabled sound power. You could choose between one of 12 imperiled human rights. And what I really wanted to show you is just how this actually does, I think, relate directly to what was going on. Protection was the human right most voted for in a city terrorized by ICE. This was in Los Angeles, followed closely by body autonomy and a healthy planet. So we both invite participation and we receive some kind of insight into how people are thinking and feeling. So biomimicry, as I mentioned before, and we've seen with Mushroom Cloud and Motherboard and Together, is an ongoing obsession of mine. As Luciana Parisi argues in Abstract Sex, the boundary between natural and technical processes has never been fixed. Each is always operating through the logic of the other, although I would argue in terms of perfecting a protocol, nature wins every time. This very entanglement is what I was attempting with Substrate, our recent co-built AR project commissioned by LACMA and appearing soon, by the way, at the Brooklyn Public Library, one of the branches. Substrate is a multivalent project of futuristic civic imagination. This systems project features 3 mother trees, a community college, which was in Long Beach, a county museum, art museum, LACMA, and a public library, Los Angeles Public Library. I was looking at the moral economies of mycelial networks again, as regenerative, as we said before, distributive systems of community care, and initially thought we'd find similar structures in blockchain, and we didn't. Web 3 turned out to be every bit as neoliberal as Web 2. But in this case, students curated their own exhibition from LACMA's public archive and exhibited it at the LAPD downtown. We minted it on the blockchain in the hopes that it could be redistributed through other public libraries and inspire similar projects. This was community-led curation, not top-down, bottom-up. Then, with banned books and erased histories becoming a common practice at the federal and state levels, we really wanted to invite a larger audience into the conversation, and that's where the AR came in. And I just want to show you, so I'm just going to walk you through really quickly how it worked. So you would be prompted to choose a museum, a school, or a library, and submit some artifact, idea, or artwork, or book that really had an impact on you. And then you would go out and trigger it, and your idea shows up in one of those spores. It was completely randomized. And then you could tap on all the spores and see what other people had contributed. So again, it's not someone from the outside deciding what matters or what's culturally important. You decide and you share. And the results have just been extraordinary. And I want to show you just an example of what it looks like in the back end. And what's crazy is it's not even installed anywhere right now, and people are still contributing to the archive. So as you can see, we have it categorized per, and this is just a tiny little sample of what people have contributed. So I feel really excited about that. We're coming very close to the end, but I did want to show a little more 2D work. Distortions are spatial collages that visualize the disorientation of algorithmically mediated visual culture and its impact on human perception, or at least mine. So think the VR drawing impact, but times 10. I began this series 3 years ago, and it's really taken me this long to refine the visual language of the work. With all the psyops and misinformation, algorithmic behavioral training, and operational images, I feel my own perception increasingly hyper-mediated by these disorienting illogics. And I'm also thinking a lot about noise, inside and outside machines, and how it affects discernment. But because I can't ever seem to stay in 2D, even when the collages are spatial, I really imagined what it would be like to stand inside or beside a field of entropic data. What would it literally feel like in your body? Would we seek patterns, or would we find ourselves overwhelmed? And because, again, it's not just the sculptures that end up in my films, but all the 2D, the drawings, the distortions, they're all in there. That's why I really call myself a transdisciplinary artist. There's really no separation. And I'm just going to show you a brief segment of my new film series called Carbon. This is Carbon 1, and Carbon 1 looks at ecological collapse from the whole series looks at ecological collapse from a variety of perspectives. And I used all that I learned with Seek to further embed objects in these filmic collages. So I encourage you to look underwater and look beyond the flames and the fog and see if you notice anything. As we've discussed, a handful of people profit greatly from our trained distraction, numbness, and inertia. This piece and the one that I will close with look at noise, human and machine generated, and how it impacts economics, political, social, and natural ecologies. You may recognize some of the distortions collages, all of which appear here, again, along with the widows and the slipstreams. Eric Salvaggio, the artist and writer, recently wrote, "I don't worry that AI will destroy humanity so much as I fear it will destroy the humanity within us." So this is Carbon. This is just a very brief part of Carbon 1. She writes, "Data and networks, like the people they connect, will be ever more fragile. Too hot or too cold, and the platforms will collapse. Digital infrastructures, data centers, network exchanges, and fiber optic cables will drain the planet's energy in order to create a stable environment, not for people, but for information." And I just want to shout out my brilliant sound collaborator, Ana Luisa Pedrisco, who made this layered soundscape as well for this work. So my hope is that by examining the overlapping emergencies that our species caused and in which we are now imbricated, with data systems, human cognition, and more than human intelligences, we might develop new sensitivities to the crises we face, and together, co-create better ideas, better protocols, and as a result, better futures. So thank you again for having me, and if you want to stay in touch, you can find me here. And now I think we can do questions, huh?
Sure. I'm sure all of you have lots of questions. My first question is, when do you sleep? Because it seems impossible. If you're in High C's class, I think you need to go now. But thank you for coming. Questions for Nancy?
Don't be shy. Yes.
Do you do the work entirely yourself, or you have, people working with you?
That is a wonderful question. I have wonderful collaborators. Oh yeah, I'm going to repeat the question. Do I make all of this work by myself? No, I mean, if I did that, I really wouldn't sleep. I would also look even older than I do. No, I mean, a lot of it I do myself, and I'm self-taught, as I said. So when I need to learn how to do something, I do it. When I can't do it, or it's just too big, too Sisyphean, I engage people who know more than I do and who are a lot smarter. So for example, when we, like the whole back end of the app, I do not manage that. I work with an amazing, brilliant dev. And he also helps me translate a lot of the models that I make in VR or the drawings that I make into a lot of the objects. When it comes to the film, I do a lot more of that on my own because VFX is something that, I mean, I hope everyone here feels very empowered by, frankly, YouTube, which is where I've learned a lot of skills. And of course now there's AI, but just be careful with that because, you just have to be very intentional and strategic. But most of it, I mean, certainly when it comes to really complex coding, and in the case of, I obviously direct everything, and with the sound, it's an ongoing discussion and collaboration. But when I can't do it myself, like for example with Seek, we couldn't do that. I couldn't do that without a team. That was 23K, and with we had 3 different shots. It's like a Hollywood film, so it's a production. But it just depends on it just depends, I mean, certainly it depends on the piece itself.
So how about Cento?
So Cento, I created in VR, and all of the feathers are hand drawn. And but when I had to work with my dev to work on the coding to get it to be interactive like that. And because that supports the conceptual exigencies of the work, basically it's concept forward. So I basically decide what I want to do, and in that case, I knew I wanted it to be participatory and co-built, and then together we worked on, okay, how do we make this as frictionless as possible for the user? How do we design the interface? That's all. I mean, I'm involved in every part of it except for the actual coding of that process.
Is there a question?
Yes.
I have a couple questions. I really liked the piece that was like the body and also the last 2 you showed us. I thought the sound was also a really good addition, and it also kind of sounded like a heartbeat to me, which made me feel like I was more connected to it. I wanted to ask, how do you handle like criticism about like technology, or like the conversation about technology, like taking such a big role in people's lives with making art that's so technology based? And also, there was this sphere at the end, the glass sphere.
Yes.
The last one, and I saw this it was like a TED talk, I think, in my conceptual art class last semester, and this woman was talking about how like spheres are this recurrent image in all this technology. Like, it started, she used like a Da Vinci painting, and she showed that, but then she was talking about like, I think there's a Palantir sphere or something. Yeah, there was a lot of different, I'm trying to think of not that example, but there was a lot of different examples of spheres in different technologies. What did the sphere mean for you?
It's funny, not to be too literal, but it really was a snow globe.
Oh.
And so for me, it was the kind of analog noise, that you can create yourself just by shaking a snow globe, but also the snow globe as a kind of imaginary for planetary collapse. The idea that an entire planet would be one thing or another. getting into, again, media hot and cold. So thinking about, and actually that whole piece, integrates everything from the kind of computer noise to like analog noise, but also like the beautiful noise of, I don't know, there's no reason you would know this, but there was a lot of content from where I live upstate, so fireflies flashing, dilapidated, denatured barns, things that signal and represent collapse, but maybe aren't like so on the nose, that are teased out in those. So that was not in any way me trying to participate in a sphere conversation with Peter Thiel, I can tell you that right now. But your question about technology and using technology, in my hope is that I use it as ethically and intentionally and consciously as possible. I never use it unwittingly. It's one of the reasons why I said what I did about the AR glasses. They're being used by ICE. None of this is neutral, and you'll hear that by anyone who talks about technology will say none of these tools are neutral. That is correct. However, I think that there are certain affordances, whether they're poetic or technological, that allow us access to different embodied experiences that, okay, yes, could you experience it going to a Tyrrell or to a cathedral or to Muir Woods? Surely, yes. But there are ways in which you can also augment that experience, layer that experience, and at least, I hope, it's clear that none of what I do is techno fetishistic or optimistic. In other words, I'm not making work to say, isn't this amazing? No, it is always led by the idea. And it's really important, one of the things I want to talk about in the workshop is like using the tools that support and augment and amplify the conceptual goals of the project versus the other way around. In other words, not using something just because it's trendy or it's cool, but like how does it serve, for example, like guerrilla or graffiti AR art? Well, the thing that's great about that is it's subversive. Like it's present and absent, and you can't wipe it off, and no one can, it's permissionless. So that's like the perfect medium for that kind of intervention, in my opinion. But again, like I would never claim that these things don't do harm. They all do harm. But so does banking. So do the clothes we wear. There's harm everywhere. So my feeling is just that as an artist who works with technology, I have to constantly interrogate not just my relationship to it, but who is it serving and who is it harming, and who benefits, who's profiting. It's just the bigger question. So it's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it.
Nancy, one other thing. So a lot of artists that work with technology use the tools to be critical of the technology itself. And so it's like trying to turn the tool against itself or to use the tool to understand exactly what's kind of going on with this stuff. What does it mean? So I think Nancy's kind of that's really an important part of using the thing itself to be critical of it versus like I'm going to paint a picture of it. There's something about working with the DNA that's I think a crucial part.
Yeah, and I hope that like just to put a finer point on that, like when I was doing all this research at the Bible Institute and I was reading, I'd love to share the bibliography because it was very much focused on some of these questions, and I think that's why Tell Me Everything feels like the work I'm really excited to make right now, because it attempts to like use surveillance technologies against those technologies. The term that is technically the right term is surveillance versus surveillance. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I think kind of like a similar vein of like technology is evil, but it's great to work with. How do you like? Because I feel like with the app and like with having the AR sculptures, people are already giving permission by installing the app. So what does it mean, or like how do you have these conversations with people who either are unwilling to install the app or just like unwilling to proceed
I would love to have a conversation with someone who works at Palantir. Palantir is interested in talking to people like me. If someone doesn't want to experience the work this way, that's fine with me. It's a complete opt-in. I don't think anybody should ever be coerced or forced into engaging with any type of art. So, I think there is something always frictive about downloading an app, and certainly when we did In Plain Sight, which we were working with a lot of undocumented artists, there were a lot of concerns about location services and anything that relies on geolocation. Now, of course, surveillance has become surveillance technologies have gotten so sophisticated that it really doesn't, they know where you are anyway, whether you have location services enabled or not. So those are all legitimate concerns, which I've tried to allay in building the app. That's why I don't collect any user data. It would go against my ethics. I don't think all technology is evil at all, just to be clear. Certainly, like a lot of the research I've done in bioacoustics, digital bioacoustics, and working with scientists, at Woods Hole Institute, some of these ocean scientists, there are miraculous things that machine learning is now able to do, and has opened up all kinds of research venues that are really, really constructive. But when I talk about it critically the way that I do, I am talking more about surveillance technologies that also manipulate our attention and are built for basically profit. So, do you really want to know? I have a lot of ICE videos. I lived in Los Angeles for 30 years. ICE was was an ever-present, that really isn't evil. So I have a lot of ICE videos. It's a very political algorithm. Once in a while, I will get something about perimenopause, which I think is very insulting. And a lot about farming and gardening, which is the one thing that makes me happy.
And how do you continue engaging with these systems and letting them go and perpetuate harm, using Instagram, using Twitter, or whatever social media choice? What is your kind of philosophy?
I don't use Twitter. I don't use Facebook. I need to keep a Facebook account because of the monopoly Meta has on the VR headsets, which also collect biometric data. So that is not something I choose. It's something I am coerced into doing. Instagram is a problem. And I think it's one of the compromises as artists. It's hard not to have a presence on Instagram as an artist. I think using it, again, intentionally, understanding, having a kind of digital literacy around algorithmic manipulation is really crucial. So I try to be very attentive to that. I try and limit the time that I'm on. I find that it has deleterious effects, not just on me, but on everyone. I think it's cheapened, and I think it's contributed to what inspired me to make this piece called Together. I think we've forgotten that we belong to each other, and we've forgotten that we're all humans. I also think that we desperately need news systems and networks to communicate. The problem is, I use a lot of encrypted apps, for example, to communicate with people, but I can't communicate with people I don't know that way. So that is a paradox that is not yet resolved. So I would love to stand here and be able to say to you, I'm some sort of purist. I'm not. I'm subject to all the same pressures you are. But I just try and be really mindful of it. And even Substack, for example, I'm on Substack because I feel like Substack, a lot of journalists I follow are there because we have, the media ecosystem is so corrupted. And guess what? They support Nazis. It's like there is no perfect paradigm. And so I think, again, to Andrew's point earlier, we just have to always be mindful of the playground we're in, and when we can, use it subversively and use it without trying, with the least amount of harm, possible. Yeah.
Yeah, you had mentioned, I think it was maybe called Genco, being surprised by the responses of people. And I'm wondering if there were other times with these projects where you had one expectation and then learned something different with the ways people interact how you build that into your practice with future projects, or not?
Oh, it's such a great question. How, like, when have I also been surprised? I will say, like, from the beginning with certainly like AR as land art, when I saw people at the Salton Sea, you know, here was this like murmuration of fish cartilage and jewels and all this other stuff, and seeing them perform with it, and not just perform with it and write themselves into the story, but the way that they ended up like collaborating with each other like perfect strangers, because you know, somebody shows up, they don't have the app, they don't have Wi-Fi, whatever, and the conversations that it prompted were really surprising to me, and that was a beautiful thing. And I learned very early on, you cannot control how people receive the work, and it's a fool's errand to try. That said, I'm always like, I'm delighted and sometimes dismayed by how they're received. Cento, I also, when she said this thing about care, when people were feeling all this love for it, I looked at the feather choices, which I mean, obviously those are my feathers. Like, I came up with those choices. I was thinking like, okay, so what do you need? What would you need to survive? You know, we're on the verge of a sixth extinction. What do you need? And I'm thinking like, you know, defense, communication, toxic filtration. And it never occurred to me to do like love, community. I was like, oh my God. So, you know, things also come up after the fact. I think the other thing that was really surprising to me, when I made Aftermath, when projecting onto the sculpture and having it occupy this very strange territory, both aesthetic and conceptual, where people don't know what it is. I remember I had it installed, I first did it in a gallery in LA, and then I did it up in my studio upstate. And I've had a number of people come through who got very, very quiet. And there was one man who was admittedly not an art person at all, and he said so. And he was in tears. And and he was very embarrassed, and I, you know, obviously tried to reassure him that there's nothing embarrassing about Brian. And he said, it's just, I've never seen or experienced anything like this. And that's the other thing, you know, I think when you're operating with the same materials every day, they're quotidian, they feel like, oh yeah, this is what I do, this is what I do. And then once in a while you'll have this moment where someone experiences something they've never seen before, and that can be a moment of wonder or transcendence or sadness. I mean, you know, it's not all great, but in that case, you know, I wasn't prepared for that reaction, and by how moved people seemed. And part of that may have also been because it was after the fires, and we were all reeling from that emotionally and sort of metabolically.
Maybe just a quick follow-up. You said the idea of joy.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
and you just said wonder. Are you thinking about incorporating those as you move forward, or how do you conceive of that as part of your work?
I am so excited that you asked that question, because I didn't have time to say this earlier. As we develop the adaptive soundscape for Together, which involves, I mean, we're using everything from like, you know, the Earth's magnetic core to bees, to dolphins, to bats and hummingbirds and human hums. I was just talking to the sound collaborator, and we were listening to some sound sketches, and I, just listening to them, started to like laugh and cry all at once. And because I got so excited, and I thought, that is the thing, like if I can prompt anything like that, again, I can't control it, but my hunch is that if I'm feeling it, someone else might feel that too. And the surprise of it, but also just the reassurance and the curiosity, like those are all things I want to engage all the time. But I want to do it without being trite or silly or flattening something. Because I think, you know, joy can be elicited by not things that are quote unquote happy per se, but things that maybe surprise you or prompt an emotion that you weren't expecting to have, you know? Or that make you want to like dance around the balcony in front of strangers.
Okay, I think we're getting close to the end. Maybe one final question? Yeah.
I also ask, so you do like lots of art that interacts with participants and interacts with data sets. How do you find yourself, like, this is related to the last question, but like constructing the bounds of that so that it still feeds into your own vision of the project while still giving autonomy to those participants?
Okay, that is such a superb question because I have found that some parameters are not only necessary, but end up like having some boundaries or some of those decisions that you're talking about end up eliciting more creativity, not less. So, for example, and we can get into like content moderation. When like with Cento, I've limited the choices to 12. So you are making a decision, whether it's aesthetic or conceptual, but you're making a decision based on those parameters. That to me felt manageable and also didn't feel like so open-ended that you end up with this like, I don't know, like mishmash that doesn't look like anything and weird. With Substrate and upcoming this project called Free at Alcatraz, now we're asking people to contribute things that are very specific and individual. And so again, having those parameters, we can't contain it, and I don't want to contain it. Again, I don't want to have a flattening. And I tell you, it is a challenge. I don't believe we still have a First Amendment, but what I consider First Amendment rights, it is challenge, because sometimes people write things that I find not very compelling, okay? I won't say what they were, but certain books that were influential for reasons that I think I don't agree with. Guess what? I have to say, I invited you into a conversation. Your voice is as valid as mine, so we leave it. Now, if someone just like puts a bunch of like garbled letters, I take that. But I feel like you want to give enough guardrails so that that it can be a real conversation and really deliver data that's meaningful, rather than just being like it's a free for all, So that has been a learned. Every project I learn more along the way, but I do think that those having some limits is usually good. Okay, thank you all so much.
I want to also thank Peter Jackson and Amelia and
Yes.
Kelly and everyone on the committee.
Thank you.